The night was cold, with a biting wind that seemed to cut through the clothes of anyone who dared face it. The streets were almost deserted, except for a few homeless people scattered in alleys and sidewalks, trying to warm themselves under pieces of cardboard and tattered blankets. Thomas, a respected businessman in the city, was making his usual rounds, distributing food and clothes to those in need. He believed that financial success only made sense if he could help transform lives. With his truck loaded with hot meals and new blankets, he parked at a corner where a group of beggars usually gathered. Thomas got out of the vehicle with a warm and genuine smile that seemed to heat the environment more than any blanket could. "Good evening, folks. I brought some things for you," he said as he opened the rear door of the vehicle and began distributing the items. His gesture was always received with grateful looks, but that night, one face caught his attention. A man named Jeff, thin and with eyes full of sadness, was sitting a little apart, shivering with cold. Thomas walked over to him with a bag and knelt down, meeting his eye level. "Here, Jeff. I know it's not much, but it'll help you get through the night." Jeff looked at Thomas with tears in his eyes. "You always help us. I don't know how to thank you. It seems like nobody else cares about us anymore." The man's voice was choked, as if he had been holding back tears for a long time. Thomas placed a firm but gentle hand on Jeff's shoulder and replied, "You don't have to thank me. We all deserve dignity, Jeff. Just promise you'll take care of yourself, okay?" The man nodded vigorously, clutching the bag as if it were a treasure. "I promise, Mr. Thomas. God bless you for everything." After delivering the items to the rest of the group, Thomas returned to his truck with a sense of duty fulfilled. Helping others gave him a purpose that went beyond the profits of his company. He drove to his office, located in a more remote area of the city, surrounded by a dense forest. The company was his second home, and he often spent nights there solving problems or planning new projects. When he arrived at the parking lot, he noticed how the silence of the night there was deeper, almost oppressive. The wind made the trees whisper, creating an unsettling sound that seemed to echo all around. As he closed the truck door, something caught his attention. A quick, almost imperceptible movement among the shadows of the trees at the edge of the forest. Thomas frowned, tilting his head to try to see better. It was an isolated area, and he knew that at that hour of the night no one usually wandered around there. Still, what he saw seemed more than just the wind swaying the branches. "How strange," he muttered to himself, adjusting his coat to protect himself from the cold as he took a few steps towards where the figure had passed. For a moment, he considered the possibility of it being just a nocturnal animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon, but something about the way the figure moved intrigued him. It was uncommon for animals in that area to get so close to the buildings. Thomas stopped at the edge of the parking lot, his gaze fixed on the darkness of the forest in front of him. The tall trees seemed to form an impenetrable wall, with deep shadows that appeared to dance as the wind swayed the branches. He stood there for a few seconds, trying to convince himself that there was no reason for concern. "It must be something in my head," he said softly, but the discomfort persisted. The feeling of being watched was almost palpable, as if the darkness were lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. Still, his curiosity overcame his apprehension. He took a deep breath and took a few more steps towards the edge of the forest. "Is someone there?" Thomas asked out loud, his voice echoing among the trees. He tried to sound firm, but the sound that returned was that of his own echo mingling with the silence. Nothing answered except the rustling of leaves and the occasional crackling of branches in the wind. Still, he was certain he had seen something. He was not the type of person who let themselves be swayed by superstitions, but there was something about that night that seemed wrong, something he couldn't identify. Determined to find out what it was, Thomas moved a few more steps into the forest, his eyes alert for any movement. The ground was damp, covered by a thick layer of dead leaves that crackled softly underfoot. The air there seemed different, colder, almost heavy. The faint light from the parking lot lamps dimly illuminated the first rows of trees, but beyond that, everything was darkness. Thomas looked around, trying to find some clue as to what might have caused the movement, but all he saw were the shadows of the trees dancing in the wind. He felt a shiver run up his spine, as if the very environment around him was trying to warn him to turn back. However, he ignored the instinct and continued forward. Suddenly, a sound behind him shattered the silence like an explosion, in the void of the night. It was the dry snap of a branch breaking, so loud and clear that it seemed to tear through the freezing air. Thomas spun around quickly, his heart pounding in a frantic rhythm. He tried to focus his gaze into the darkness, but the shadows seemed denser, more alive, as if they were conspiring against him. "If this is some kind of prank, you can stop now," he shouted, forcing his voice to sound firm. However, the tone of tension that escaped was undeniable, betraying his attempt to demonstrate control. The ensuing silence was almost deafening, laden with an invisible presence that seemed to observe him closely. Thomas stood motionless, his muscles tense, feeling the cold sweat trickle down his temples despite the icy air. The seconds dragged on like hours, and the emptiness around him seemed to whisper something he couldn't understand. He held his breath, listening intently, but he could only catch the muffled sound of his own heartbeats. The feeling that he wasn't alone grew, pulsing in his gut like a silent scream. The sound could have been caused by the wind or an animal, but his instinct said otherwise. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He took a hesitant step back, his shoe crushing dried leaves underfoot, shattering the silence like an alarm amidst the unknown. Then came the blow, a sudden and violent impact that struck his back with devastating force, knocking him to his knees. The hard, damp ground received him with a thud that reverberated through his body, but the pain that spread like fire was what truly paralyzed him. Thomas gasped, his lungs struggling to pull in the air that seemed to have been ripped from his chest. His mind spun in confusion as he tried to understand what had happened. He brought his trembling hand to his back, but the pain was so intense he could barely move his fingers. What was that? He thought, as the reality of the situation began to unfold like a nightmare. He tried to look back, but every movement was torture. All he managed was a fleeting glimpse of a figure disappearing among the trees, quick and silent, like a shadow dissolving in the light. Fear struck him with full force, like a crashing wave that left him breathless. The realization that he was in real danger, that his life hung by a thread, gripped his mind. Thomas tried to scream for help, but his voice seemed stuck, as if the air around him had been completely sucked away. The cold, which had previously been merely uncomfortable, now seemed to freeze his body from within, draining what little strength he had left. With an almost superhuman effort, Thomas began to drag himself. Every inch gained seemed like an impossible challenge, and the light from the parking lot lamps, once so close, now seemed an unattainable goal, receding further and further into the horizon of his blurred vision. He felt his body grow heavy, the searing pain in his back consuming his energy with every movement. But the fear of being attacked again drove him to continue, even as his arms trembled and his legs no longer obeyed. "I need to get out of here," he muttered to himself, but the words were almost inaudible, lost in the void. As he dragged himself, his mind began to bring fragmented images of his life, like a slow-motion film. He remembered his family, his moments of success, the times he reached out to help those in need. Jeff's face flashed through his mind, along with the thought that perhaps his generosity had made a difference. "Jeff, I hope you're okay," he said in a feeble, almost inaudible voice. The idea that he had dedicated his life to doing good gave him some solace, but it also made the moment seem even crueler. How could someone who lived to help have such a violent end? Thomas began to wonder who could have done this. Was it an unknown enemy, someone he had helped and who somehow saw him as a threat? Or perhaps it was merely the bad luck of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, encountering the kind of evil that needs no reason to exist. The questions consumed him as he continued to drag himself, but he knew he would never have the answers. The light of the parking lot still shone in the distance, but it seemed more like an unreachable beacon, mocking his desperate efforts. The world around him began to darken, and the feeling of weakness took over. Finally, Thomas stopped. Every fiber of his body seemed to have surrendered, unable to fight against the pain that consumed him or the crushing weight of exhaustion that enveloped him. His arms and legs, once determined to move forward, were now motionless as if frozen in time. His vision, once filled with shadows and flashes of light, began to gradually darken, until everything around him dissolved into a dense and oppressive gloom. The darkness paradoxically seemed welcoming, a relief from the suffering he could no longer endure. There was no more sound of leaves or wind, only a heavy silence, almost tangible, that filled the forest like a veil of mourning. The air around him seemed still, dense, as if nature itself was holding its breath, accompanying his last moments. The trees, once threatening, now swayed gently in the wind, their branches leaning forward as if in a silent reverence. Thomas, in his final thoughts, felt a strange peace arise. It was as if the forest accepted him, as if it knew that there his journey would end. The world, once so full of noise and chaos, had now transformed into a quiet, introspective place, where his mind finally found space to rest. In the depths of his mind, Thomas clung to a thread of hope. He remembered Jeff and the many others he had helped throughout his life. Would those actions, small to the world but significant to those who received them, be enough to give meaning to his existence? He wanted to believe so. He wanted to believe that even in the face of such a cruel and mysterious end, his life had been more than numbers in a bank account or meetings in offices. His kindness, his compassion, could not be in vain. This thought kept him steady as his body yielded piece by piece to the inevitable. With heavy eyes, Thomas allowed his eyelids to close for the last time. The darkness enveloped him completely, but not as something frightening or empty. It was a serene darkness, which brought with it a promise of rest. He felt no fear, only a strange relief. It was as if the weight of his worries, his pain, and even the mystery of his fate disappeared, being carried away by the gentle breeze blowing through the forest. He surrendered to the moment, feeling the almost comforting presence of nature around him. As his last thoughts dissipated, the world continued to move, indifferent to the end of his story. The trees kept swaying, their leaves whispering ancient secrets that no one could understand. An absolute silence took over the place, as if the forest were paying tribute to the man who had fallen at its edge. There, among the shadows and the distant light of the parking lot, Thomas found his goodbye. There were no spectators, no farewells, only the tranquil swaying of the trees and the silent embrace of the night, which seemed to guard his last breath as an eternal secret. The next day, on a cold morning, as the sun struggled to break through the treetops, casting pale beams of light on the still damp ground from the night's dew, William, an elderly gentleman with hair as white as snow, walked down the street with slow but determined steps. He took that path almost every day, believing that a good walk was the best way to maintain his vitality. The silence was almost absolute, interrupted only by the rhythmic sound of his shoes against the asphalt and the sporadic singing of birds hidden among the branches. Everything seemed peaceful until something caught his attention. Among the trees lining the end of a nearby company's parking lot, William noticed something that seemed out of place. A strange glint reflected by something metallic, and beside it, a dark shape he couldn't immediately identify. He stopped, squinting to see better. What could that be? He muttered to himself, feeling an unexpected shiver rise up his spine. Against his better judgment, William decided to investigate. Curiosity propelled him, and besides, something in that scene seemed to demand his attention. Perhaps it was just litter carelessly discarded by someone, but there was something unsettling about that sight. With careful steps, William left the sidewalk and entered the forest, the dry leaves crunching under his feet with a sound that seemed louder than normal, amplified by the oppressive silence around him. The dense vegetation seemed to close in on him, forming a kind of natural tunnel that blocked much of the sunlight. The air there felt colder, almost suffocating, and the faint scent of damp earth mingled with a metallic odor he couldn't immediately identify. A shiver ran up his spine, and he felt that each step he took was taking him further away from the safety of the street. Still, something compelled him to continue. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps the feeling that something terrible demanded his attention. The further he advanced, the more details of the scene began to emerge before him, like a puzzle slowly revealing itself. First, he saw the reflection of light coming from something metallic on the ground, a fleeting glint that seemed to cry out for his attention. He squinted, tilting his head to see better, but the reflection was soon overshadowed by the sight of a dark form lying among the leaves. William stopped for a moment, his breathing becoming irregular as he tried to process what he was seeing. "My God," he whispered, his voice almost getting lost in the void. The sound of his own heartbeat pounding seemed to fill the silence around him, making it difficult to distinguish if he was hearing anything else. With faltering steps he approached, fear growing with every inch that separated him from what he already suspected was a body. When he got closer, the scene became clear. It was a man lying face down, his clothes crumpled and covered with dry leaves that seemed to have been dragged by the wind. William felt the weight of shock invade him, a mixture of disbelief and despair that almost made him lose his balance. He recognized Thomas's face immediately. It was impossible to mistake that man, known for his generosity and constant presence on the streets helping those in need. "Mr. Thomas, what happened?" he shouted, his voice echoing among the trees like a lost cry for help. His body seemed frozen for an instant, but the need to act soon took over. He knelt beside the body, his trembling hands hesitating between touching or not. William was not a doctor, but he knew he had to do something. "Are you alive? Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice charged with urgency, as his gaze scanned Thomas's motionless face for any sign of life. Finally he reached out, gently touching Thomas's shoulder, but the rigidity of the body and the complete absence of reaction caused his hope to dissipate like smoke. The reality of what he saw began to solidify in his mind, bringing with it a growing panic. William took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that insisted on betraying him. He knew he needed help, but he felt vulnerable, as if the forest around him was watching. The feeling of being exposed, alone and without answers, was almost unbearable. He looked around, but all he saw were the shadows of the trees and the subtle movement of the leaves blown by the wind. "I need to call for help," he thought aloud, almost as an attempt to convince himself that he still had control of the situation. He thrust his trembling hand into his coat pocket, searching for his phone, but the object seemed to slip through his fingers, as if the very nervousness was conspiring against him. Before he could dial, an unexpected sound nearly stopped his heart. Hurried footsteps and voices in the distance broke the heavy silence of the forest, carried with an authority that seemed even more threatening. William looked towards the sound, his eyes wide with alert, and saw the scene change before him in a matter of seconds. Red and blue lights began to dance between the trees, casting distorted shadows on the ground and the surrounding trunks. The sirens, which he had not noticed before, now seemed deafening, cutting through the air like blades. He stood up abruptly, the phone still in his hand, but his movement only drew more attention. "Stop right there! Hands where we can see them!" shouted an authoritative voice, followed by the sound of breaking branches under the hurried feet of two police officers emerging from the shadows. Both had guns drawn, their gazes fixed on William as if he were solely responsible for the scene before them. The gentleman's heart raced, and he instinctively raised his hands, the phone slipping from his fingers and falling to the ground with a dull thud. I didn't do anything," he exclaimed, his voice trembling and full of desperation, as his eyes darted from the officers to Thomas's body. "I was just passing by and saw something strange. I came to see what it was." The tension in his voice was evident, and the fear of being misinterpreted weighed heavily on every word he spoke. The gentleman, visibly shaken, tried to explain. "That's Mr. Thomas, the businessman. He was lying here when I arrived. I swear I just wanted to help." The officers exchanged quick glances, as if trying to assess the situation. One of them, still holding his gun, asked, "You found him like this? Didn't touch anything, right?" William vigorously shook his head. "I touched his shoulder, tried to see if he was alive. But I didn't move anything else, I promise." His voice was sincere, but the evident nervousness made it difficult for the officers to rule out his intentions. The officer checking the body stood up, his face grave. "He's dead. Looks like an attack," he said gravely, looking at his partner. William felt his legs weaken, as if the ground beneath his feet had vanished. He nearly collapsed to his knees again, but held himself up with a tremendous effort. His eyes, wide with shock, darted from Thomas's body to the officers as words escaped his mouth like desperate murmurs. "No, this can't be true," he said, his voice failing as if every syllable was a painful effort. Who would do such a thing to him? He was a good man, someone who helped so many people. The words echoed through the forest, filling the silence with a palpable pain. William brought a trembling hand to his chest, trying to contain the tightness he felt, as if his heart was being crushed by an invisible force. It was such an intense emotional shock that he could barely breathe. The officer still holding the gun noticed William's fragility. He relaxed his stance, but his eyes remained fixed on the gentleman, evaluating every movement as if any hesitation could be a sign of guilt. "We're going to need you to come with us to give a statement," the officer said, his calm tone contrasting with the tension in the atmosphere. William raised his gaze, his eyes shining with tears he couldn't contain. "Give a statement?" he repeated, incredulous. "You think I did this?" His voice rose, laden with indignation and fear, but he soon fell silent, realizing that a defensive tone would only worsen his situation. He took a deep breath, trying to reorganize his fragmented thoughts. "I just wanted to help. I just wanted to know what was going on," he murmured, his voice low, as if he were speaking more to himself than to the officers. As the officers began securing the crime scene, the sound of sirens intensified. More police cars arrived, their red and blue lights cutting through the dimness of the forest and casting dancing shadows on the tree trunks. The contrast of those lights with the natural darkness of the place was almost surreal, as if the very environment had been transformed by the tragedy. William watched in silence, his body still trembling, his arms crossed instinctively, as if trying to protect himself from the cold or the circumstances around him. He saw the officers working efficiently, covering Thomas's body with a white sheet and cordoning off the area with yellow tape. The scene was so absurd, it seemed pulled from a nightmare. Sadness and fear swirled together into a whirlwind inside William. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Thomas's now covered body, but every second he stared at that sheet seemed to steal away a little more of his sanity. How could something so terrible have happened? He thought, his chest tightening with each unanswered question. He tried to find some logic, some explanation, but everything seemed to elude his understanding. Thomas was a good man, an altruist, someone who used his time and resources to help those in need. Why would anyone take the life of such a person? And above all, why did he, William, have to be the first to stumble upon that horror? The cruel irony of the situation was almost unbearable. The forest, once a refuge of peace and natural beauty, now felt laden with a dark, suffocating weight. Every tree, every shadow seemed impregnated by that tragic event, as if the place would never be the same. William knew the memory of that scene would haunt him for the rest of his days. He could barely imagine how he would explain his presence there, how he would make others understand that all he wanted was to help. The injustice of the situation consumed him, and the silence, once welcoming, now seemed full of accusations he didn't know how to answer. The emptiness around him was oppressive, and the only certainty left was that this morning had changed his life forever. The courtroom was packed. Every bench in the room was occupied by people from the town, curious and indignant, eager to witness the trial of the man who, according to the accusations, had committed the terrible crime. The air was heavy, saturated with murmurs and looks of disapproval directed at William, who was seated in the dock. His hunched shoulders and trembling hands resting on his knees clearly showed the state of his spirit. The elderly man didn't look like a murderer, he looked like a defeated man. Despite this, the gaze of the public carried disdain, as if his guilt had already been decided before the trial even began. William couldn't face the room. Every time he raised his eyes, he encountered faces expressing nothing but anger and contempt. They think they know the truth, he thought, trying not to succumb to the panic growing in his chest. But they don't know. I didn't do any of this. The image of Thomas's body lying among the leaves in the forest continued to haunt him, replaying like a film he couldn't turn off. He remembered how he had knelt beside the man trying to help, and how everything crumbled when the police showed up, treating him like a culprit without even listening to his side of the story. The judge entered the courtroom, and the murmur ceased instantly. Everyone present stood up, including William, who needed the help of the officer beside him to keep his balance. His knees were weak, not only from age but from the unbearable weight of the accusation he carried. The judge took his seat, and the trial began. One by one, the prosecutors presented their evidence, painting a dark image of William. They showed crime scene photos, highlighted the presence of his fingerprints on Thomas's body, and emphasized that he had been found alone in the woods beside the corpse. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the case is clear," said the prosecutor, pointing at William as if he were an object, not a human being. "Here we have a man who, for reasons we do not yet fully understand, took Thomas Sinclair's life, a pillar of this community. Thomas was a generous man who helped those in need. and his death left a void that will never be filled. Mr. Hayes was found at the crime scene with his hands on the victim's body, without any plausible explanation for his presence. This, coupled with the evidence presented, leaves no doubt as to his guilt. William clenched his fists, his pale, wrinkled fingers trembling as he heard every word. "That's not true," he muttered, too quietly to be heard. The defense attorney did what he could to counter-argue, but his words seemed weak against the emotional weight the prosecutor placed on his accusation. It was evident that the case was not being decided solely on the evidence. The public, the jury, and even the judge himself seemed to have already formed their opinions based on the commotion generated by Thomas's death. The trial progressed quickly, with testimony from witnesses who barely knew William, but were ready to reinforce the prejudice against him. "I saw him near the woods a few times," said a woman who lived close to the crime scene. "He always seemed strange. Who knows what he was planning?" Similar testimonies followed, and none of them helped William. He felt cornered, like a trapped animal, and with each passing minute, it became clearer that his voice would be ignored. Finally, the moment of the verdict arrived. William was sitting with his hands clasped in his lap, and his eyes fixed on the floor as the jury returned to the room after deliberating. The silence was absolute. Every movement, every breath seemed amplified in the tension of the moment. The judge looked at the jury, and the foreman stood up, holding the paper containing the decision. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" asked the judge, his voice firm. "Yes, Your Honor," replied the foreman. He paused, a pause that seemed to last an eternity, before uttering the words that would seal William's fate. "We find the defendant, William Hayes, guilty of murder in the first degree." The impact was immediate. The room erupted in murmurs, shouts of approval, and in some cases applause. William felt as if the air had been ripped from his lungs. He sat motionless, the words echoing in his mind as he tried to process what had just happened. Guilty. The word seemed like a physical blow, something he could not bear. He slowly raised his head, his eyes wide and brimming with tears. "I'm innocent," he whispered, but his voice was drowned out by the noise around him. The judge banged his gavel on the bench, the dull sound reverberating through the room, echoing like a final blow to William's already fragile life. The silence that followed was almost as unbearable as the words that came right after. "William Hayes, the jury has found you guilty of murder in the first degree," declared the judge, his voice laden with an impersonal formality that seemed to ignore the devastating impact those words were causing. The tone was firm, almost mechanical, as if he were simply following an inevitable script. But for William, each syllable was a blow that cut deeper than any physical assault. The next sentence was even crueler. "The sentence of this court is death by electric chair." Those words fell like stones, crushing any remaining shred of hope William might have had. He felt as if the ground had disappeared from under his feet, leaving him suspended in an endless abyss. The room around him seemed to shrink, the walls closing in slowly, as reality enveloped him like an icy chain. His body reacted before his mind. His legs buckled, and he had to lean on the table in front of him to keep from falling. His trembling, frail hands gripped the edge of the wood tightly, but it did little to alleviate the feeling that he was crumbling from the inside. I want to appeal," he managed to say, although his voice barely rose above a whisper, trembling with the mixture of fear and despair that overflowed in every word. He slowly turned his head to look at his lawyer, searching for some trace of reassurance or conviction in the man who was supposed to be his last line of defense. But what he found was an expression of resignation, almost as if the lawyer had given up even before trying. "We'll try," the man replied, but the lack of firmness in his voice cut William like a sharp blade. There was no strength, no hope in that tone. It was merely a formality, something he had to say, but which they both knew was futile. The impact of that exchange was brutal. William felt his chest tighten, as if the air was being sucked out of the room, leaving him unable to breathe. The world seemed to spin around him, but he couldn't move, trapped by the crushing gravity of condemnation. His thoughts were scrambled, a chaotic mix of memories, fear, and disbelief. How had he come to this point? How could the life of a man who had merely tried to help be reduced to this? He looked around the room, hoping to find something, anything, that could alleviate the feeling of isolation that consumed him. But all he saw were cold, accusing stares. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to carry their own sentence in their eyes, a condemnation heavier than the judge's words. William wanted to scream, to plead for justice, but he knew his voice would not be heard. He stood before a system that had already decided his fate, and his innocence seemed to matter to no one there. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather strength to face what was to come, but the darkness behind his eyelids only intensified the weight of reality. The electric chair. The thought was so terrifying that he couldn't bear it for more than a few seconds before opening his eyes again. William knew in that instant that his chances were almost non-existent. The court sentence was final, but what hurt even more was the certainty that he would be remembered as something he was not. His reputation, built over years of honest work and acts of kindness, had been destroyed in a matter of days. He wanted to fight, to prove his innocence, but the forces that once sustained him now seemed to have abandoned him. All that remained was the echo of the judge's words, reverberating in his mind like a relentless hammer. Guilty. Death penalty. Electric chair. As the guards approached to take him back to prison, William looked around the room, searching for a single face that seemed to believe him. But all he found were looks filled with disapproval, as if his guilt was unquestionable. As he walked toward the exit, the murmurs of the audience turned into direct insults. "Murderer!" shouted a woman, pointing her finger at him. "He deserves to die!" A man yelled, while others shook their heads as if disappointed that justice had not been swift enough. Outside, a crowd awaited him. Signs with phrases like "Justice for Thomas" and "Death to the Monster" were raised in the air, and the crowd's shouts seemed to grow louder with every passing second. As soon as William emerged from the courthouse, escorted by police, the crowd erupted in a chorus of hatred. "Monster! Coward! You don't deserve to live!" The words hit him like invisible blows, each one reinforcing the feeling of utter isolation. Someone threw a plastic bottle, which struck his shoulder before falling to the ground. Another threw a crumpled piece of paper that got caught under his feet as he walked slowly toward the police car. William tried to keep his head held high, but it was impossible. The shame and pain were overwhelming. He looked at the crowd, his eyes brimming with tears, and asked out loud, "Why does no one believe me? I didn't do it." But his voice was swallowed by the crowd's shouts, which seemed thirsty for revenge. He got into the police car, his handcuffed hands resting on his lap as the vehicle pulled away. The crowd continued shouting, but the sounds began to fade as the car drove off. On the way back to prison, William looked out the window. The city he knew so well now seemed a strange and hostile place. He saw people on the sidewalks, some pointing at the car, others simply ignoring it. He closed his eyes, trying to block everything out, but the images of the courtroom, the crowd, and above all Thomas's body in the woods continued to haunt him. He knew the fight was lost. No matter how hard he tried, no one was willing to listen to his version of events. In the cell, the loneliness was suffocating, as if the narrow walls and low ceiling were a physical weight on his shoulders. William sat on the small bunk bed, staring at the cold, lifeless wall, its peeling paint seeming to reflect the emptiness he felt. He thought about his life, revisiting memories that now seemed like fragments of a distant dream. He remembered the peaceful days when he walked the streets without fear, greeting neighbors with a genuine smile, and the afternoons when he sat on his front porch, listening to the sound of the trees in the wind. Those simple moments, which had once seemed so commonplace, now carried a bittersweet weight like relics of an existence he would never have again. All of it seemed to belong to another reality, inaccessible and unrecoverable. The memories came with a painful clarity, highlighting the contrast between the past and the gloomy present. He thought about the times he had helped those in need, the small but sincere gestures of kindness that defined his life. Now, sitting in that claustrophobic space, it all seemed futile. He was there awaiting the day when he would be taken to the electric chair, an end he knew he didn't deserve. There was nothing more to do, only to endure the crushing weight of injustice and the slow, silent wait for an outcome that seemed like a sentence against his very existence. The smell of freshly baked apple pie lingered in the air. It was sweet, nostalgic, a stark contrast to the coldness of the cell where William awaited his final moments. He was sitting at the small table, a plate with a slice of the dessert in front of him. The pie was lightly golden, the filling glistening with the heat of the oven. For anyone else, it could have been just an ordinary meal, but for William, that plate was laden with memories. He looked at the pie for a few seconds before picking up the fork. The sight of the sweet brought flashes of his childhood, of afternoons spent in his mother's kitchen, where she made pies for the family while he played around the table. With trembling hands, William cut a small piece and brought it to his mouth. The flavor, sweet and slightly tart, exploded on his palate, taking him back to those carefree, happy moments of his youth. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to savor not only the taste but the memories it evoked. For an instant, the cell disappeared, and he found himself once again sitting at the table in his childhood home, hearing his mother's laughter as she told him, "Always save a piece for others, William. Sharing makes life sweeter." When he swallowed the piece, reality came back with force. The distant sound of keys, the heavy footsteps of guards in the corridor, all served as a cruel reminder of where he was and what was to come. He carefully set the fork down on the plate, looking at what remained of the pie. He had no appetite, but he knew this would be his last meal. The weight of that thought was crushing, almost impossible to bear. "Apple pie," he murmured to himself. Never imagined it would end like this. The guards approached the cell. Their expressions were neutral, almost professional, but William could see something more in their eyes, discomfort, perhaps even pity. He knew that for them this was just a job, but still the impact of leading a man to his death could not be ignored. One of the guards cleared his throat and spoke in a low but firm voice. "It's time, Mr. Hayes." William nodded, rising slowly. He looked at the plate one more time before leaving the cell, taking with him the taste of apple pie as his last connection to a world he was about to leave behind. The corridor seemed endless. The rhythmic sound of William's footsteps echoed off the cold walls, like a relentless, repeating lament with each movement. With every step, the tension in the air seemed to increase, making the atmosphere almost unbearable. He kept his head held high on the outside, but inside he felt crushed. His downcast eyes betrayed the whirlwind in his mind, a swirl of thoughts that refused to organize. Each strategically positioned camera along the corridor captured every detail, every labored breath, every hesitant movement, as if recording the last moments of a man condemned for eternity. William didn't look at them. He knew he would be seen, but he no longer cared. It was as if everything around him was just a shadow, while his mind repeated a single thought. "I am innocent." These words were his refuge, his last line of defense against the crushing reality. "I am innocent," he whispered to himself, making no sound, as if the mantra could ward off the fate that awaited him. He thought about the sentence, the weight of being accused of something he didn't do. But what hurt the most was thinking about the people he would leave behind. His neighbors, who knew him as a kind man, the people he had helped without asking for anything in return, even the strangers who had crossed his path and felt his kindness. Would any of them believe in his innocence? Would someone somewhere stand up to defend him? The uncertainty was as painful as the condemnation itself. When they arrived at the execution chamber, the visual impact was like a punch to the gut. The sterile space, with its white walls and fluorescent lights, seemed to project a coldness that penetrated to the bone. It was a place devoid of any trace of humanity, designed solely to fulfill a macabre purpose. In the center, the electric chair stood waiting, a silent and menacing presence. It was simple, almost banal, but in its functionality, there was something profoundly terrifying. The cables, the buttons, the leather straps, everything seemed to be waiting, as if that moment was an inevitability that could not be avoided. William stopped at the entrance, feeling the weight of the air in his lungs. He took a deep breath, trying to gather strength to take the next steps. Every muscle in his body seemed to resist, as if his very existence was trying to delay the inevitable. His eyes slowly swept over the faces of the few present in the room. The prison warden was solemn, his rigid expression indicating the gravity of the moment. The chaplain maintained a serene posture, but in his eyes there was a trace of compassion that seemed almost painful to behold. The two court-appointed witnesses were there merely to witness, their expressions neutral, as if they were mere spectators of a cold spectacle. William felt the weight of every gaze, but said nothing. There was something solemn about his walk to the chair, as if each step was a silent farewell. The guards led him to the center of the room, where the chair awaited him. Their hands, rough but careful, guided William to sit down. He moved slowly, as if each gesture was imbued with meaning. His eyes wandered for a moment, fixing on insignificant details, the edges of the leather straps, the metallic shine of the screws, the texture of the wooden chair. Every detail seemed amplified, as if his mind was clinging to anything to avoid thinking about what was to come. When he finally settled in, the sound of the straps being adjusted around his wrists, ankles, and chest seemed to echo in the room, each snap increasing the tension in the atmosphere. Despite the firmness with which the guards worked, their movements were almost gentle, as if they were aware of the gravity of the moment. There was no rush, no carelessness. It was a job that required precision, but it also seemed imbued with a silent respect. William felt the straps tighten around his body, limiting his movements. The vulnerability of the moment was overwhelming, but he maintained his composure. There would be no screams, no pleading. He had decided he would face this with dignity, because deep down he knew the truth was with him. The chaplain approached, the Bible in his hands. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but full of sincerity. "Would you like a prayer, Mr. Hayes?" he asked, leaning slightly so William could hear. For a moment, William hesitated. He knew the chaplain offered this with good intention, but what he really wanted was not a prayer. It was justice. It was the truth. He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the chaplain. "I don't need a prayer now, I need the truth." His words echoed through the room, weighted with a gravity that made the chaplain step back slightly, respecting his decision. The atmosphere remained silent as the final preparations were made. William closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find some semblance of peace amidst the chaos. The chaplain's words, the sound of the straps and the echoing footsteps in the room seemed to fade away. All he felt was the weight of his own breathing, slow and steady, as he prepared to face the final moment. Before proceeding, the prison warden made the customary announcement. "Mr. William Hayes, you have the right to say your last words." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the man in the chair. William raised his head, his gaze steady and charged with emotion. He took a deep breath and spoke clearly, his voice echoing through the room. "I am innocent." The words came out with force, laden with pain, but also an unwavering conviction. He repeated, his eyes fixed on a distant point, "I am innocent." Then William raised his left hand, trembling slightly, and made the sign of the cross. The scene was simple but charged with meaning, as if that gesture was his last way to demonstrate his faith, not only in God, but in his own truth. The final preparations began. The technician adjusted the electrodes on William's head and legs, while the others moved away, taking their positions. The room was tense, each person feeling the weight of what was about to happen. It was at that moment that the door of the room burst open, interrupting the process. Everyone turned to see Detective John, panting, as if he had run the entire way there. He held a thick envelope in one hand, and his eyes were wide, filled with urgency. "Stop the execution," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. The prison warden raised his hands, signaling for everything to be paused. "Detective, what's going on?" he asked, confused by the sudden interruption. John stepped forward, handing the envelope to the warden. "I discovered something. Something that changes everything," he said, his breath still heavy. "The killer who murdered Thomas Sinclair is right-handed. He used his right hand to strike the blow. William Hayes is left-handed." The revelation dropped like a bomb in the room. For a moment, no one said a word, but the silence was soon replaced by murmurs and expressions of astonishment. William looked at the detective, his eyes brimming with emotion, as if he were seeing a light at the end of a tunnel he believed to be endless. Tears threatened to spill, but he held them back, unable to fully believe what was happening. His chest rose and fell in short, nervous breaths as his mind tried to grasp the meaning of the scene unfolding before his eyes. He didn't know whether to believe it or not, but for the first time in months he felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. The weight that had crushed him until that moment seemed to loosen, though uncertainty still loomed like a dark cloud. The prison warden examined the documents in the envelope, each line he read making his expression more somber and laden. The silence in the room was absolute, tense, almost tangible, as if everyone were holding their breath at the same time. Each second seemed to drag on, until the warden looked up, and his words cut through the air with authority. "Stop everything. This execution is suspended." Those words echoed in the room, releasing the air everyone seemed to have been holding. There was a collective movement of relief, but also of disbelief. Guards, technicians, and observers exchanged dumbfounded looks, as if they couldn't believe the relentless sequence of events could be interrupted. The guards, once so firm in their movements, began to undo the straps that bound William to the chair. Each unbuckled strap seemed a step towards freedom, but also carried the weight of everything he had endured until then. William remained motionless, his eyes fixed on a distant point. He was in shock, as if his body had not yet received the message that this was real. His hands were trembling, and even when the straps around his wrists were removed, he didn't move them. It was as if he were paralyzed by the mixture of relief and disbelief. When he finally stood up, his legs faltered for an instant, but he leaned on them, gathering the strength that remained. He looked at the detective, and in that moment, his expression changed. William's eyes, so accustomed to pain and despair, now shone with genuine gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice faltering slightly, as if the word carried all the weight of the emotions he couldn't fully express. The detective nodded, but his expression remained serious, almost grave, as if he knew the moment of relief was only the beginning of something bigger. "This isn't over yet, Mr. Hayes," the detective said, his words firm but not devoid of compassion. But today the truth prevailed. William left the room escorted by the guards, but something inside him was different. His steps, once heavy and dragging, were now firmer, as if the newly discovered hope had restored some of his strength. As he walked down the same corridor where minutes earlier he had felt the crushing weight of condemnation, he noticed something that seemed almost impossible. The sweet taste of apple pie was still in his mouth. It was a simple taste, but charged with meaning, a reminder of who he was, of his childhood, of a time when the world seemed fair and welcoming. For the first time in a long while, William felt that perhaps there was justice, even in a world that so often seemed cruel and indifferent. William was sitting in a small interrogation room, lit by a cold fluorescent light that seemed to intensify the feeling of helplessness that had accompanied him for weeks. The air in there was heavy, almost suffocating, and the only sound besides the faint hum of the lamp was his fingers drumming nervously on the metal table. Despite being free from the electric chair, the weight of the accusation still loomed over him like a dark cloud. He knew he needed to tell his version of the story once again, but the idea of not being believed left him tense. Detective John was sitting across the table with a serious posture, but his attentive gaze indicated he was willing to listen. "So, Mr. Hayes," John began as he opened a notebook, "please describe your steps in detail on that day. Any information could be crucial to clarifying what happened." William took a deep breath, resting his elbows on the table and interlacing his hands in front of him. "I've told this before, Detective," he said, in a calm but weary tone. "I was walking down the street that morning, as I do almost every day. I always make a point of keeping my routine. I pass through the square, greet the people I meet, and continue to the trail near the woods. It's a peaceful walk, you know. It helps clear the mind." He paused for a moment, as if reliving every step of that fateful day. John kept his gaze fixed on William for a few more seconds after hearing his response, as if weighing every word spoken by the man before him. There was something in William's posture that made him hesitate to doubt him completely. His eyes, still marked by weariness and anguish, carried a sincerity that was hard to ignore. Each sentence he uttered seemed laden with truth, even when his voice trembled at the mention of Thomas's body. John knew he had heard many tales throughout his career, many of them carefully constructed lies, but something in William's tone seemed different. "And you didn't see anyone nearby? No movement or sound that indicated someone was there?" John repeated, leaning slightly forward, elbows resting on the table as he watched every one of William's reactions. He was looking for any sign of hesitation, anything that could contradict what had been said. William shook his head slowly, his expression closing into a mixture of frustration and sadness. "Nothing," he said, the word coming out almost like a sigh. The forest was silent. All I could hear was the sound of the leaves under my feet. And the silence, a heavy silence. He paused, taking a deep breath as if reliving the moment in his mind. By the time I realized it, the police were already there, and before I could explain, they treated me like I was guilty. They didn't give me a chance to say anything. They just handcuffed me. John kept nodding slowly, his fingers drumming lightly on the table as he evaluated what had been said. The expression on his face was inscrutable, but there was something in his gaze that indicated he was listening intently, trying to fit the pieces of that puzzle together. Before he could formulate a new question, the silence in the room was interrupted by an abrupt sound. The door burst open, slamming against the wall, and a young officer strode in with firm steps, holding a notepad in one hand. His expression carried an undisguised arrogance, and his eyes passed over William with the kind of contempt that only worsened the tension in the room. "Why are we wasting time with this, detective?" the officer blurted out, completely ignoring William's presence. He closed the door with a shove and leaned against the wall, crossing his arms disdainfully. "This old man's already been convicted. He only escaped the electric chair by luck. I don't know why we're sitting here listening to this story, when we should be putting him back where he deserves to be." The words fell like stones on William. He slowly raised his eyes, his expression marked by weariness and humiliation. As accustomed as he was to people's distrust and judgment, hearing something like that directly was almost unbearable. His face burned with shame, but also with indignation. He knew he needed to stay calm, but the weight of everything he had endured made it increasingly difficult. "I'm innocent," William said, his voice low but firm. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a determination in his words that seemed to cut through the air. "I've said that from the beginning." His eyes fixed on the officer, and for a brief moment he felt the need to continue, to defend himself. But he knew it wouldn't do any good. For that man, his guilt was already set, regardless of any evidence or testimony. The officer seemed surprised by the rebuke, but shrugged as if he didn't care. "You're the boss, detective," he said, sarcasm evident. He tossed the notepad onto the table before turning to leave the room, but not without casting one last look at William. "Hope you wrap this up soon," he muttered, before slamming the door shut. When the silence returned, William let out a heavy sigh as if trying to release the tension that had built up in his chest. He looked at John, trying to understand if that detective truly believed him or if all of this was just standard procedure. "Detective," William began, his voice hesitant but sincere, "I know my word doesn't seem enough, but everything I'm telling you is the truth. I didn't kill Thomas. I wouldn't do something like that." John nodded, but didn't respond immediately. He continued observing William intently, as if trying to decide if the man before him was trustworthy. Finally he spoke, his voice softer than before. "Mr. Hayes, I still don't know what happened in that forest, but I'm here to find the truth. And if what you're saying is true, it will come to light. It always does." Those words offered William a small comfort, but he knew the path to proving his innocence would be long. For now, all he could do was keep repeating his truth, even when no one seemed willing to listen. Before the officer could retort, a shrill sound interrupted the discussion. The station's phone rang, its sound echoing down the hallway and into the interrogation room. John exchanged a glance with the officer before picking up the phone that was on the table beside him. "Detective John speaking," he answered, his voice laced with authority. What he heard next made his expression change instantly. "Wait, can you repeat that?" he said, leaning in slightly as he jotted something down on a sheet of paper in front of him. The silence in the room became almost unbearable as William and the officer watched intently. "You're saying you know who killed Thomas Sinclair, and you saw what happened?" The response on the other end seemed to confirm the information, because John stood up abruptly. "All right, we need you to come down to the station immediately to give a statement. Your information could change everything." He hung up the phone and turned to face William, who seemed torn between hope and fear. "A witness has just called," John said, his voice graver. "She claims she saw what happened to Thomas and knows who the killer is." The words echoed in William's mind as if he were trying to process what he had just heard. He gripped the edge of the table tightly, feeling the tension in his arms and the weakness in his legs. Finally, there was a real possibility that his innocence would be proven, but along with hope came fear. What if it was another trap? What if, even with a witness, he was still guilty in everyone's eyes? Detective John looked at him, sensing the mix of emotions on the man's face. "Mr. Hayes, this is not a guarantee yet, but it is an important step. I will personally interrogate this witness. In the meantime, I suggest you rest and wait." He paused, his gaze softening a bit. The truth always finds a way to surface. You just need to be patient." The officer, who had been silent until then, shook his head in disbelief. "So now we're going to believe the word of someone who appears out of nowhere?" he asked, with evident sarcasm. "Suddenly, we have a magic witness. That sounds too convenient for me." John stared at him firmly. "Convenient or not, it is our duty to investigate. Remember that we are police officers, not judges. Our obligation is to the truth." William, who until then had remained silent, finally found the strength to speak. He looked at the detective with a serious but hopeful expression. "Detective, thank you for not giving up on the truth." John nodded, but his face was still tense, as if he carried the weight of an immense responsibility. As he left the room to deal with the new clue, William closed his eyes for a moment. For the first time, he felt that justice was within his reach. They scheduled at the cafeteria, and at the scheduled time they went there. The cafeteria was a simple but cozy place located on a busy corner of the city. The polished wooden tables were arranged along the large windows, offering a clear view of the street. The smell of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, mingling with the sweet aroma of pies and cakes displayed in a display case near the counter. William and Detective John arrived early, waiting for the witness who had scheduled the meeting. Both were silent, each immersed in their own thoughts. William, sitting with his hands on the table, looked at customers coming and going, trying to identify someone who could be the witness. There was an anxiety in his movements, the slight drumming of his fingers against the wooden surface betraying his nervousness. He knew that this meeting was crucial. If the witness really knew who had killed Thomas, it could finally be the proof of his innocence. "Do you think this person will show up, Detective?" he asked, breaking the silence. His voice was tense, but there was a glimmer of hope. John, sitting on the other side of the table, was calm, but his eyes were watching every corner of the place intently. "If they called the station, there's a chance," he replied, not taking his eyes off the door. "But we need to be prepared for anything. Witnesses sometimes get scared or change their minds." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "We just need to wait." The minutes ticked by, and the clock on the wall seemed to move slower with every second. William checked the door with each new customer coming in, but no one seemed to approach. Time was starting to weigh heavily, and the uneasiness in the air was becoming palpable. "We've been here for almost an hour," said William, impatience beginning to show in his voice. "What if this person doesn't show up? What if this was just a cruel joke?" John frowned, placing the coffee cup on the saucer with a soft metallic sound. "Calm down, Mr. Hayes. Let's give it a few more minutes. We can't rule anything out yet." He pulled his phone out of his pocket, quickly checking the messages. No contact, no sign of the witness. Suddenly a man entered through the cafeteria door, drawing discreet glances from some patrons, but without causing a major commotion. He was wearing ordinary clothes, a worn dark jacket and jeans that had seen better days, but there was something about his presence that seemed out of place. He was holding a black trash bag, an odd detail in that cozy setting, where the aroma of coffee and sweet pastries hung in the air. His posture was rigid, his shoulders tense and his gaze quick, as if he were calculating every move. His steps were firm and decisive, cutting through the space between the tables with a determination that instinctively made William lift his head. As the man approached, the sound of his footsteps seemed louder than normal, echoing in William's mind like a warning. He sensed that something was wrong, but couldn't pinpoint what. There was something about the man's movements, the way he held the bag, that sent a chill down his spine. The stranger stopped a few steps away from the table, where William and Detective John were seated, and his gaze fixed on them with an unsettling intensity. "You're the ones on the Sinclair case, right?" he asked, his rough voice cutting through the silence surrounding the table. The dry, direct tone left no room for casualness. It was obvious he had something specific in mind. John looked up, maintaining his composure, but there was a slight shift in his expression. His eyes narrowed, assessing the man before him, while his shoulders leaned slightly forward in an almost imperceptible gesture of alertness. He was an experienced professional and knew how to recognize when something was out of the ordinary. "Yes," he replied, his voice laced with professionalism and a touch of caution. "Are you the witness?" William, sitting beside him, felt the air change. He looked at the man, trying to decipher his expression, but all he saw was an expressionless face, a mask that revealed nothing. There was something odd. something that didn't fit. His eyes dropped to the black trash bag the man held firmly, and an unsettling thought crossed his mind. Why would someone bring a trash bag to a cafeteria? He thought, but before he could voice any doubts or unease, everything changed in an instant. The man's movement was swift, almost impossible to follow. 1 second he was standing before them. The next, his hand plunged into the bag and emerged with something that glinted in the cafeteria light. It was a knife, long and sharp, reflecting the light like a deadly warning. William barely had time to react before the man lunged with surgical precision, the blade finding John's abdomen in a direct strike. The muffled sound of impact, followed by John's stifled gasp of pain, seemed to freeze time around them. John stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock and his hand instinctively going to the stabbing site. The other hand tried to reach for his gun at his belt, but the movement was slow, hindered by the sudden blow. His body seemed to yield to the weight of pain and surprise, and he almost lost his balance. William was paralyzed for a moment, his brain struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Then, as if awoken by a survival instinct, he abruptly stood up, the chair he was sitting on falling backward with a crash. "Detective!" he shouted, his voice laden with panic and disbelief. The assailant, as if he had planned every detail, dropped the trash bag on the floor, letting it fall with a dull thud, and quickly turned toward the exit. His steps were quick and determined, and within seconds he had crossed the door and vanished into the busy street. The silence in the cafeteria was broken by shouts and murmurs of shock. Some patrons stood up and ran outside, while others ducked behind tables seeking shelter, even though the danger was already out of the premises. William rushed to John, who was now kneeling on the floor, one hand pressing against the wound as his breath came out in short, ragged gasps. The knife was still embedded in his side, and blood was starting to spread across his shirt and onto the floor around him. The sight was terrifying, and William felt his hands tremble as he knelt beside the detective. "Stay with me, detective," he said, his voice quivering but laced with urgency. His eyes scanned the place, searching for help, but everything seemed a blur of panic and chaos. John lifted his head slightly, his eyes half closed in pain. His breathing was labored, but his voice still carried the steadiness of someone accustomed to extreme situations. "Don't remove the knife," he muttered, pausing between words to catch his breath. His tone was weak, but still carried authority, as if he wanted to ensure William didn't make a fatal mistake. William nodded quickly, trying to remain calm, although panic was visible on his face. One of the cafeteria employees, a young woman with trembling hands and a pale face, grabbed the phone and called for an ambulance. Other patrons, still in a state of shock, were starting to recover and trying to help as best they could. "They're coming," William said, turning back to John while trying to reassure him. "You'll be okay. Just keep breathing. Help is on the way." But inwardly, he knew time was of the essence, and every second felt like a test of patience and faith. John tried to speak again but gave up, closing his eyes for a moment as he focused on breathing. The blood kept spreading, staining the floor red, and William felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He firmly held John's shoulder, attempting to convey some strength even though he was crumbling inside. All he could do was wait, praying that the ambulance would arrive in time. The minutes that followed seemed like an eternity, but finally the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Paramedics rushed into the cafeteria, carrying a stretcher and medical equipment. They worked quickly, stabilizing John and carefully placing him on the stretcher. William stood by, feeling powerless but unwilling to leave. "Is he going to be okay?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. One of the paramedics looked at him, offering an encouraging smile. "He's lost blood, but he's stable. We're taking him to the hospital now." William followed the ambulance to the hospital, where he waited anxiously while John was taken into surgery. He paced back and forth in the waiting room, arms crossed and eyes fixed on the floor. He couldn't get the attack out of his head, the glint of the knife, the blood, John's look before being taken away. What did it mean? Who was that man? And why attack them at that very moment? After a few hours that seemed like an eternity, a doctor finally came out to speak with William. The man, dressed in an impeccable white coat and a professional expression, approached slowly, carrying in his posture a mix of calm and weariness, like someone who dealt with difficult situations daily. "Detective John is out of danger," he said in a controlled tone, but one that carried a slight note of relief. His words seemed to carry the weight of what could have been a tragedy, but wasn't. The knife didn't hit any vital organs, but he'll need rest to fully recover. William, who was sitting in one of the uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room, let out a deep sigh. The immediate relief that washed over him was like a wave, cleansing the tension that had built up in his shoulders since the attack. He felt his muscles relax slightly, although anxiety still lingered in the back of his mind. "Can I see him?" he asked, rising slowly, almost as if he didn't believe that the nightmare was finally receding. The doctor nodded briefly, indicating the way with a wave of his hand. Upon entering the room, William found John lying in the bed, the white sheet covering him up to his chest. The pallor of his face was evident, a stark contrast to the vitality he had displayed before. However, his eyes, though a little tired, were open and alert. They turned slowly to William as he entered, and there was something reassuring in his expression, as if he wanted to communicate that, despite everything, he was still there. "Are you all right?" William asked, his voice soft but laced with genuine concern. He took a few hesitant steps toward the bed, as if afraid to disturb the fragility of the moment. There was a mixture of gratitude and guilt in his eyes, reflecting the weight of what had happened. He knew John had put himself at risk, and now the detective was there, injured, for trying to help clear his name. John smiled slightly, a smile that seemed to require more effort than usual, but one that still carried an unwavering determination. His voice, though weak, came out firm and direct. "I've been better, but I'll survive." He paused, adjusting himself slightly in the bed, as if trying to find a more comfortable position. Despite the evident pain, there was something in his posture that communicated a silent strength, a refusal to be beaten down by circumstances. After a moment, John looked at William with a seriousness that seemed to cut through the room. "This wasn't an accident, Mr. Hayes," he said, each word laden with conviction. "Someone doesn't want the truth to come out. But that only gives me more reason to keep going." His words hung in the air, a reminder of the danger they both faced, but also a statement of purpose. John was a man who lived to seek justice, and nothing, not even an attempted murder, seemed capable of derailing his trajectory. William nodded slowly, feeling the weight of John's words. There was a deep gratitude in his gaze, but also a shadow of guilt. He knew that in a way the detective was there because of him, because of the truth that still needed to be uncovered. "Thank you, Detective," William said, his voice laden with emotion, "for not giving up even with all of this." He paused as if trying to find the right words to express what he felt, but everything seemed insufficient. The simple thank you seemed the only possible gesture. John smiled again, a weaker smile but still genuine. He took a deep breath before responding, his voice soft but full of meaning. "The truth is always worth it." The words lingered in the room, echoing in William's mind as a reminder that despite everything, there was still something worth fighting for. As he watched the detective rest, William felt that for the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone in his pursuit of justice. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was heavy. John had insisted on returning to work immediately after being discharged from the hospital, despite William's protests. The detective was visibly pale, with slower movements and slight stiffness, but his determination was unwavering. Each step he took towards the forensics lab seemed laden with purpose, even though the effort was evident. William followed closely behind, concerned, but aware that trying to stop him would be futile. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Detective?" William asked, breaking the silence. John gave him a firm look with a small smile. "Rest can wait, finding the truth can't." In the forensics lab, the knife used in the attack on John was carefully laid out on a stainless steel tray under bright lights. The environment was silent, except for the constant sound of the forensic technician's keyboard as she worked on analyzing the fingerprints. William stopped near the table, looking at the blade with a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. The idea that this object had almost taken John's life still deeply unsettled him. The technician, focused on her task, only noticed their presence when John approached. "We were able to locate partial fingerprints on the knife," she informed them, adjusting her glasses. "We're running them through the system to identify the perpetrator." John nodded, leaning in slightly to examine the object. His expression was serious, but there was a gleam of determination in his eyes. He knew that this knife was a key piece in unraveling what was behind the attack and the Sinclair case, How long until we have a result? He asked, his voice calm but laden with anticipation. The technician glanced at the screen for a moment before responding. The system is nearly finished. Hopefully we'll have a name in a few minutes. William, by John's side, watched every detail of the interaction, anxious for the outcome. He felt that this moment could bring crucial answers. As they waited, the silence was filled only by the sound of the computer processing the data. William, restless, looked at John, breaking the silence with a hesitant question. "Do you think this print will lead to someone actually connected to the case?" John kept his eyes fixed on the knife for a few seconds before answering. "Whoever it is, they knew what they were doing, and more importantly, someone sent them. That's the thread we need to pull." John's words were direct, but carried a weight that William couldn't ignore. Suddenly, the shrill sound of the computer cut through the tense silence of the lab, like an alarm announcing more than just the end of an analysis. The technician, who had been immersed in the screen until then, quickly read the results, her brows furrowing in a clear sign of concern before turning to face John and William. "The name associated with the prints is Leonard Barrett," she declared, her voice firm but laced with gravity. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing denser as the information hung between them. "He's registered as a homeless person and has been arrested for petty theft in the past." William felt a chill run down his spine as he heard the name. He didn't recognize Leonard, but the mention of a homeless person in the context of a case already so confusing seemed to add a layer of complexity that he didn't know how to process. His gaze turned to John, whose posture remained unwavering, but with a visible tension in his eyes. "Leonard Barrett," John repeated slowly, as if etching the name into his memory. He turned to the technician, his voice firm and direct. "We need to locate this man immediately. Notify the field team and start tracking his latest movements." The technician nodded and began typing rapidly, making calls and coordinating efforts with the efficiency of someone accustomed to pressure. Meanwhile, William remained silent, his mind racing to try and find some logic in all of this. After a few moments, he finally spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Do you think he's the culprit?" John, who had been keeping his eyes fixed on the knife on the table, looked up and met William's gaze. "I don't know yet," he replied, his voice laden with gravity. "But he's our next step, and every step brings us closer to the truth." Less than an hour later, the field team's efforts bore fruit. Leonard Barrett was located at a nearby downtown shelter. He was apprehended without resistance, but his behavior made it clear he was nervous. When they brought him to the precinct, he seemed restless, his eyes constantly wandering around the room as he was escorted by the officers. His clothes were worn, a dirty pair of jeans and a jacket that had clearly seen better days. His unkempt hair and stubble gave him an appearance that mixed exhaustion and mistrust. In the interrogation room, John entered with slow steps, still visibly affected by the injury, but his presence was unmistakable. He carried an authority that filled the space, making Leonard shrink slightly in his chair. William, on the other hand, stood in a corner of the room, observing everything intently. The tension in the air was almost palpable. "Leonard Barrett," John began, his voice calm but carrying an intensity that demanded attention. He sat across from the man, his eyes fixed on him, analyzing every move, every reaction. "Your name is tied to the fingerprints on the knife used against me. I want you to tell me exactly why you had that knife." Leonard averted his gaze, his shoulders hunching as if he wanted to disappear into the chair. His hands trembled slightly, and he ran his tongue over his lips before responding. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "I was paid to do this. That's all. I needed the money." The room fell silent after the confession, Leonard's words hanging in the air like an unbearable weight. John remained calm, but the tension in his posture was evident. He exchanged a quick glance with William, whose expression was frozen between surprise and unease. "Who paid you, Leonard?" John asked, his voice now charged with intensity. Leonard hesitated, running his hands over his face in a gesture of growing nervousness. He seemed to be struggling with himself, as if there was something he feared to say. After a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, Leonard took a deep breath, as if each word he was about to utter carried the weight of his own condemnation. He finally spoke, his voice low and laden with hesitation. "It was a guy named Jeff," he said almost in a whisper, as if fearing that the name itself could invoke something terrible. His statement seemed to resonate through the room like an echo, each syllable piercing the tense silence. "He said you were meddling in things you shouldn't. Gave me the money and the knife. I just did what he asked." Leonard hung his head, avoiding John's gaze, his trembling hands resting on his knees. William felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. The name, so familiar and unexpected, was like a punch in the gut. A cutting chill ran down his spine, and he instinctively clenched his fists, trying to process what he had just heard. "Jeff?" he asked, almost voiceless. The word came out hesitant, almost choked, as if uttering that name would confirm a thought he refused to accept. "The same Jeff we know?" His eyes were fixed on Leonard, seeking some clue, some confirmation that this was a mistake. But the man's expression, marred by guilt and fear, told William all he needed to know. John remained silent for a few moments that seemed endless, his gaze fixed on Leonard as he processed the information. His eyes, once merely attentive, were now somber, reflecting the growing gravity of the situation. He knew this new revelation added a layer of complexity to the case that few could foresee. Slowly, he leaned forward, his voice lower but still firm and authoritative. "Where can we find Jeff?" he asked, the tone laden with controlled intensity. John knew that pushing too hard could make Leonard close up, but he needed answers. Leonard raised his eyes for a moment before shaking his head slowly, his face a mixture of despair and confusion. "I don't know," he replied, almost in a whisper. "He just showed up and disappeared after he gave me the knife. Never saw him before that." His voice was almost inaudible by the end, as if he wanted to disappear along with the words he had just uttered. He lowered his head again, as if he wanted to escape the weight of John and William's gazes, but the silence that followed was even more suffocating. The revelation hung in the room like a dense cloud, fraught with doubts and implications that no one there was ready to face. William felt his breathing quicken as his mind raced to find some logic in that name being tied to something so sinister. He mentally relived the moment he met Jeff, the humble appearance, the shy smile, the gesture of gratitude for small kindnesses. How could someone who seemed so needy and harmless be involved in something so treacherous? The bitter taste of betrayal started to form in his mouth, but he knew he couldn't let himself be consumed by it at that moment. John, for his part, ran his hand over his face in a tired gesture, his eyes fixed on the table between them. He seemed to be trying to put together a puzzle whose pieces were completely out of order. "Jeff," he muttered, as if testing the name out loud, trying to understand how it fit into what he knew so far. He raised his gaze to Leonard, studying every line of his expression before slowly leaning back in his chair. "If he paid you to attack me, that means he's not just involved. He's directly linked to all of this." The tension in the room was almost palpable. The case, which was already complicated enough, had just turned into something even darker and more intricate. William ran his hand through his hair, a nervous and automatic gesture, as he tried to organize his own thoughts. "He seemed so normal," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. "Just another person trying to survive." His voice was laden with disbelief, as if he still couldn't accept that the man he had helped was now at the center of such a violent and calculated scheme. John raised his hand, interrupting William's train of thought, his expression loaded with a determination that seemed almost palpable. "Whatever Jeff is or whoever he's trying to protect, this is not over yet," he said, his voice now firmer, each word charged with conviction. It was as if he had found a new starting point amid the chaos, a clear direction amid the growing confusion. He's not acting alone. Someone else is pulling the strings on all of this, and we're going to find out who. His words were a statement, a commitment to the truth, even if the path to it was dangerous and uncertain. William looked at John, still struggling to process the whirlwind of emotions and information. The detective's words echoed in his mind, but their weight seemed overwhelming. "You really think this goes beyond Jeff?" William asked, his voice hesitant, almost a whisper. He didn't know if he wanted to hear the answer, but something inside him needed to understand. John turned to him, his eyes fixed on William's, carrying a gravity that made it clear he had already considered this possibility. "I don't think, William," he replied, pausing to emphasize his words. "I know." The silence that followed was dense, almost suffocating, filling the space with a sense of anticipation and uncertainty. William averted his gaze to the floor, feeling the weight of the situation grow with every second. The idea that Jeff, someone he had seen as needy and vulnerable, was linked to something so dark was difficult to accept. But the suggestion that there was someone even bigger behind it all, manipulating everything, made the situation even more frightening. "If he's not alone," William began, hesitant, "then that means there's a bigger plan. Something we're not seeing yet." John nodded slowly, crossing his arms as he pondered the implications. "Exactly," he said, his voice grave. "Jeff is a piece. Maybe an important piece, but still, just a part of something bigger. And the fact that he sent someone after me shows that we're getting close to something they don't want us to find out." His posture was tense, but there was a clear determination in his words. He was accustomed to dealing with complexity and danger, and it seemed to fuel his will to move forward. The room suddenly felt colder, as if the gravity of the conversation had drained the energy from the environment. William ran his hand over his face, trying to clear his mind. "But how can we find Jeff now? If he disappeared after sending Leonard, he could be anywhere." His voice was laden with doubt, but also with a growing frustration. The uncertainty of the moment seemed to weigh heavier with every minute. John, however, remained steadfast, his gaze focused. "If he's so interested in stopping us, he'll show up again," he said, with calculated calm. "And this time we'll be ready for him." John's words brought a brief relief to William, but the weight of what was to come still hung over them both. He knew the detective was right. Jeff wasn't alone, and uncovering who was behind it all would be as dangerous as it was necessary. The silence filled the room once more, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence charged with promises, decisions made, and an uncertain future they would have to face together. After days of intense investigation, concrete clues finally emerged about Jeff's whereabouts. An anonymous source reported that he had been seen coming and going from an abandoned house in an isolated neighborhood, surrounded by trees and far from the main road. The location was perfect for someone who wanted to disappear, and John's team knew they couldn't waste any time. The detective, still recovering from the attack, insisted on leading the operation. "Jeff won't get away again," he said, adjusting his bulletproof vest with determination. William, by his side, couldn't help but worry about John's health, but he understood the urgency and intensity of the moment. Upon arriving at the house, the surroundings seemed deserted. The building was in ruins, with boards covering the windows and the roof partially collapsed. The once white facade was dirty and peeled, as if time and abandonment had consumed its vitality. The officers surrounded the property, positioning themselves strategically as John and William approached from the front. Each step seemed to weigh more than the one before, and the silence around amplified the tension. William looked at John, who raised his fist, signaling that it was time to act. "Jeff!" the detective shouted, his firm voice echoing through the house walls. "We know you're in here. Come out now with your hands up." For a few seconds, the response was absolute silence. The air seemed denser, almost suffocating, as everyone waited for some sign of movement. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs broke the silence. It was a low sound, as if something had been knocked over. John pointed to the stairs with a nod, and the officers began to climb slowly, weapons drawn. William followed behind, feeling his heart race. The creaking of the floorboards seemed louder than it should, each sound echoing through the house like a warning. On the upper floor, they found Jeff in a small, dimly lit room. He was hunched over an open suitcase, his hands trembling as he rummaged through something inside. When he noticed the officers, his eyes widened in panic, and he took a step back, as if considering fleeing. "It's over, Jeff," John said, his voice heavy with authority. "Don't make this harder on yourself." For a moment it seemed like Jeff might run, but he soon gave up, slowly raising his hands. The officers handcuffed him without resistance, but the look on Jeff's face was one of anger and despair. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice low and full of bitterness. "I did what I had to do." As Jeff was escorted out of the room, William began to inspect the surroundings. On top of an improvised table made from an old door, there was a pile of cash, a credit card, and some documents. He picked up the items, immediately recognizing Thomas's name on the card. "This belongs to Thomas," William said, holding the objects for John to see. Among the items were also an ID and other belongings that had clearly been stolen from the victim. John looked at Jeff, who was being led away by the officers. His expression hardened even more as he saw the evidence. "So not only did you kill him, but you also robbed him," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. On the way to the police station, the silence inside the car was almost unbearable. Jeff was in the back seat, between two officers staring straight ahead, while John and William occupied the front seats. William couldn't take his eyes off the rearview mirror, watching Jeff with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "I don't understand how someone could do this," William said, more to himself than to the others. "I helped him. I believed he needed help. And now this." His voice trailed off and he looked away, trying to control his emotions. John briefly placed a hand on William's shoulder, saying nothing. There were no words that could ease that burden. Days later, the trial began. The courtroom was packed, with journalists, onlookers, and Thomas's family members present to follow the case. The prosecution laid out the evidence in a compelling manner. The money, the cards, the stolen documents, and of course Leonard's confession, stating that he had been paid by Jeff to attack John. Jeff's defense tried to argue that he was just a desperate, penniless man easily manipulated, but the evidence was overwhelming. The case seemed clear, and a conviction was practically certain. William watched the trial with a mixture of relief and sadness, feelings that seemed to alternate in intensity with each new argument presented in court. He felt that justice for Thomas was finally drawing near, a sense that, at least in that aspect, things were moving forward. However, the weight of knowing that Jeff, someone he had helped and considered a victim, was at the center of that heinous crime was almost unbearable. Each detail presented at the trial seemed to deepen the emotional wound he carried. He remembered Jeff as a humble, lost soul, someone who accepted help with a shy smile and words of gratitude. Now he saw him in a new light, a man who had used his vulnerability as a mask, hiding dark intentions and a cruelty William could never have imagined. As he listened to the evidence being presented, William felt as if he were reliving every interaction with Jeff, questioning every gesture, every word. "Could I have noticed?" he asked himself, the thought echoing in his mind. Guilt seemed to envelop every fiber of his being, as if he had somehow contributed to what happened. He averted his gaze from Jeff in the defendant's box, unable to look directly at the man who had betrayed not only his trust, but also his faith in human goodness. William felt torn between the desire to understand what had motivated Jeff and the need to distance himself completely from that episode. But then, the unthinkable happened. During a recess in the trial, as Jeff was being escorted back to his cell, the pent-up tension in the courtroom exploded into chaos. Everything happened so fast that the information came in fragments. Somehow Jeff managed to attack one of the guards, disarming him with a skill and precision no one expected from someone like him. Within seconds, he grabbed the guard's gun and pointed it at the other officers, intimidating them enough to create an escape route. The muffled sound of hurried footsteps and shouts echoed through the hallways, and soon the news of the escape spread like wildfire. Panic gripped the courthouse. Murmurs of shock gave way to disorganized chaos as journalists scrambled to report the incident and officers tried to control the situation. William was in the hallway talking to John when a breathless officer arrived, his face pale and eyes wide. "He's escaped," the officer said, his voice trembling, as if he couldn't believe his own words. For a moment, silence fell over everyone. William felt the ground disappear from under his feet again, the weight of disbelief and fear growing inside him. Jeff, the man he had helped, was now on the loose, armed, and most likely willing to do whatever it took to escape justice. John's expression grew somber, his gaze hardening as he processed the information. Wasting no time, he began organizing the search, his voice laden with authority and urgency. "I want all city exits blocked immediately," he said into the radio as he walked toward the parking lot. William followed, still in a state of shock but determined to help. "He's not going far," John said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Not this time." There was something in John's tone that seemed like a promise, an unwavering commitment that Jeff would be captured. In the parking lot, police cars sped off, their sirens cutting through the afternoon silence with a sound that seemed to intensify the gravity of the situation. John and William were in the first vehicle, with the detective taking command of the radio and coordinating the field teams. Every instruction given by John was precise, his voice remaining steady despite the chaos reigning around him. William, seated beside him, watched it all with a mixture of fear and anger. He knew that with Jeff on the loose, no one was safe. The man had already proven capable of anything to protect his secrets, and William couldn't shake the idea that somehow this was far from over. As the car sped through the bustling streets, William's thoughts seemed as chaotic as the sirens echoing around them. He couldn't rid himself of the image of Jeff, that man who months ago had seemed so frail, so lost, now transformed into someone cold, calculating, and relentless. What's he thinking now? William wondered, watching the city lights blur past the car window. Jeff was fleeing, but to where? Did he have a carefully plotted plan, or was this just the desperation of someone cornered? Each possibility seemed more disturbing than the last, and the uncertainty about Jeff's next move made William's stomach churn. While Detective John remained focused on the radio, coordinating the searches with near-military precision, William plunged into a whirlwind of doubts and fears. He tried to seek some logic, some clue in his previous encounters with Jeff that could explain how that man had become something so dangerous. Has he always been like this? Thought William, his face laden with a tense expression. Or was it something that happened later, something that pushed him down this path? But no matter how many times he went over the memories, he found nothing that could have indicated this dark side. It was as if Jeff had hidden behind a perfect mask, and now, unmasked, he revealed a version of himself that William could never have imagined. The weight of the moment increased with every second. William knew that the hunt was not just about capturing Jeff, it was about preventing him from causing further havoc, more pain. If he did this to Thomas, thought William, a shiver running down his spine, who else is he willing to hurt to protect his secrets? The idea that Jeff might hurt more people, perhaps even those trying to capture him, made William's blood run cold. He looked at John, who kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his expression as impenetrable as a wall. There was something reassuring about John's calmness, but also a visible tension in his posture, as if the detective was bracing for the worst. He's running, but how far does he think he can go? William asked, breaking the silence in the car. His voice came out lower and more hesitant than he intended, reflecting the mixture of fear and confusion that dominated his thoughts. John shot him a quick but meaningful glance before responding. "Jeff is smart enough to know he won't escape forever," he said, his voice firm but with a somber tone. "But desperation can make people believe they have a chance, even when they don't. And that makes him even more dangerous." John's words hung in the air, laden with a gravity that seemed to fill the space around them. William felt a knot form in his stomach, the tension almost unbearable. He knew the detective was right. Jeff was not just someone fleeing the law. He was a man cornered with everything to lose, and desperate people are capable of unimaginable things. This combination of intelligence and desperation made Jeff not only unpredictable, but potentially lethal. With every mile covered, William felt the reality of the situation deepen. There was no more room for doubt or hesitation. Jeff had to be found. His fate now lay beyond any personal question. It was a matter of justice, but also of safety for all involved. The hunt had begun again, and this time, everyone knew the outcome would be decisive. Jeff could no longer escape. The days slowly turned into weeks since Jeff's escape, but for William, time seemed frozen. Every minute was consumed by tormenting thoughts about the case, about what could have been done differently. He couldn't shake the feeling that the world around him had irreversibly changed. Jeff was still on the loose, and that was a constant weight on his mind. Even with the tireless efforts of John's team, the clues kept disappearing as quickly as they surfaced. As much as he wanted to believe that the detective would find Jeff, there was something inside William that longed to be there when it happened. He wanted to look into that man's eyes and somehow obtain the answers he so desperately sought, even though he knew it wouldn't erase the pain of what had already been done. On that day, seeking a semblance of normality, William decided to go to the local supermarket. Mundane tasks like buying groceries were a temporary distraction from the haunting reality. He slowly pushed the cart down the bright aisles, his mind wandering between the items on the list and the memory fragments that insisted on surfacing. However, amidst this state of distraction, something caught his attention. A man in the distance, with a cap partially covering his face, was carefully perusing a shelf with meticulous movements. For an instant, William thought he was imagining things. "It can't be," he muttered to himself, his hand instinctively gripping the cart's bar. He took a few hesitant steps, his heart racing with each movement. When he got a better look, the reality hit him like a blow. It was Jeff. There was no doubt. William felt the air leave his lungs. His mind whirled as he watched Jeff act like any other customer, calmly selecting products from the shelves. He seemed so ordinary, so composed, that for a moment William almost doubted his own eyes. But rage and panic quickly took over. Without making any sudden moves, he grabbed his phone and dialed John, speaking as quietly as possible to avoid drawing attention. "John," he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I found him, Jeff. He's here at the supermarket near my house." John's response was swift and direct. "Don't do anything. We're on our way. Just stay calm and keep an eye on him." Hanging up the phone, William took a deep breath, trying to control the flood of thoughts invading his mind. He knew he needed to act with caution, but being so close to Jeff, knowing all that man had done, made his anger bubble beneath the surface. He began to follow Jeff discreetly, keeping a safe distance while observing every move. The tension in his body was almost unbearable. Every step Jeff took seemed a reminder of everything that had happened, of Thomas, of betrayal, of violence. William hid behind a shelf, peering carefully between the products, trying to look as casual as possible while awaiting the arrival of the police. But every second felt like an eternity, and he felt his heart could explode at any moment. Suddenly, Jeff turned. His eyes met William's, and for a moment time seemed to stop. There was a flash of shock on Jeff's face, quickly followed by an expression of anger and determination. He realized he had been discovered. Without hesitation, he dropped what he was holding and began walking quickly toward the exit. William acted on instinct. "Jeff!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the supermarket. The shout drew the attention of everyone around, customers stopping and watching the scene with expressions of confusion and fear. Jeff looked back, his face full of contempt, and before William could reach him, he attacked. The blow was quick and brutal. Jeff pushed William hard against a shelf, knocking products to the floor in a crash that resonated throughout the aisle. William tried to react, but Jeff's strength and the element of surprise put him at a disadvantage. Before he could defend himself, Jeff landed a direct punch to his face, causing him to fall heavily to the ground. The pain was searing, and William's vision became blurred. He tried to get up, but the impact had been too strong. Still, even on the ground, he continued to look at Jeff, anger and determination burning in his eyes. Around them, customers screamed and moved away, creating a scene of chaos as Jeff tried to flee again. At that moment, the police sirens began to sound from outside. The red and blue lights danced through the supermarket windows, and Jeff abruptly stopped, realizing he was surrounded. He looked around, his frantic eyes searching for an exit. But the officers had already blocked all the doors. John entered the supermarket with his gun drawn, his expression serious and relentless. "Jeff!" he shouted, his voice laden with authority. "It's over. Drop everything and put your hands up." Jeff hesitated, looking around like a cornered animal. He knew there was nowhere left to go. Slowly, he dropped what he was holding and raised his hands, his expression hardened but resigned. As the officers handcuffed Jeff and led him away, William remained on the ground, trying to catch his breath. Each breath was accompanied by a sharp pain in his chest, a result of the brief but brutal struggle he had just endured. The metallic taste of blood in his mouth reminded him of the punch he had taken, while his heavy body seemed to sink into the cold supermarket floor. Yet none of these physical pains were comparable to the relief that began to flood his mind. He looked at the scene before him. Jeff, finally subdued, his hands cuffed behind his back, and his defiant gaze erased by a mixture of resignation and fury. As injured as he was, William felt a small victory pulsing within him. John approached with quick, precise steps, his expression laden with concern. He crouched beside William, studying him with a careful gaze. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice firm, but with a tone that revealed genuine care. William slowly raised his head, his features contorted with pain, but his eyes as determined as ever. He nodded with effort, even though every movement seemed like monumental work. "I needed to be here," he murmured, his voice almost a whisper but full of conviction. "I needed to see him taken away." John fell silent for a moment, processing William's words. Then he placed a firm hand on his friend's shoulder, a gesture that mixed comfort and reproach. "You were brave," John said, his tone grave and direct. "But you didn't need to risk yourself like that. You almost got yourself killed. Again." He shook his head, clearly frustrated, but also grateful that William was alive. William, however, didn't respond. He knew John was right, but deep down he felt this was the only place he should have been. No matter the risk, he needed to face Jeff. He needed closure, however small. As the officers led Jeff out of the supermarket, the atmosphere around seemed to shift. The customers who had earlier been in panic now watched in silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and curiosity. William ignored them. His eyes were fixed on Jeff, observing every move of the man who had turned his life into a nightmare. As Jeff passed through the entrance, he turned his head and cast one last look at William. There was something unsettling about that look, a mixture of anger, sarcasm, and a strange satisfaction. Then the smile appeared. It wasn't a smile of defeat, but something darker, almost a warning. "This isn't over yet," Jeff muttered, his words barely audible but laden with a weight that hung in the air. William closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the impact of Jeff's words spread through him like a wave. He knew that man still had cards up his sleeve, that prison didn't completely erase the shadows of what had happened. Even so, there was a small consolation in knowing that, at least for now, Jeff couldn't hurt anyone else. He took a deep breath, trying to relieve the crushing weight still pressing on his chest. But despite the relief, there was a deep exhaustion he couldn't ignore. It was as if all the pent-up tension was finally exacting its price. When the police vehicle departed, taking Jeff away, William felt the silence around him become almost oppressive. John, by his side, still watched him with concern, but William avoided looking at him. Instead, his mind was fixed on what would come next. He knew that although the hunt had ended, the scars of that day and of all the others that preceded it would remain with him. Justice, at least today, was done, William thought, trying to convince himself that was enough. But deep down he knew Jeff's words would echo in his mind for a long time. The victory seemed bitter, but it was what he had, and for now it would have to be enough. Jeff's trial was marked by an inescapable tension from the first day. The courtroom was packed with reporters, onlookers, and Thomas's family members occupying every available seat. The heinous crime, the daring escape, and the violent events that followed had turned the case into a public spectacle. But for William, sitting in one of the front rows, this was no show. It was the moment that would define whether justice would finally be served. He watched Jeff in the defendant's dock, the man who had destroyed so many lives, now in a cheap suit and with his handcuffs temporarily removed. Despite the circumstances, Jeff held his head high, his eyes casting furtive glances around the courtroom, as if he still believed he could find a way out. The prosecution presented its evidence meticulously, leaving no room for doubt. The stolen items from Thomas found on Jeff, the fingerprints on the knife used in the attack against John, and Leonard's confession, revealing he had been paid by Jeff to commit the crime, made up a solid case. The security camera footage from the supermarket, showing Jeff attacking William, was displayed on a large screen, prompting murmurs and outrage from the audience. The prosecutor, a woman with impeccable posture and a firm voice, made sure to highlight Jeff's pattern of behavior. "He is not just a criminal," she said, pointing directly at the defendant. "He is a manipulator, a man who used the kindness of others to conceal his darker intentions." Jeff, however, did not seem fazed. When it came time for his defense, he stood up, adjusting his jacket with a forced air of confidence. "All of this is being exaggerated," he began, his voice calm but full of insinuations. "I admit I made mistakes, but you're trying to paint me as a monster." He looked directly at the jury, trying to find empathy in the jurors' faces. "I lived on the streets for years. I know what it's like to be hungry, cold, and treated as nothing. I did what I did because I was desperate, not out of malice, but out of necessity." Jeff's words caused a slight murmur in the room, but William felt his anger grow. He knew every word of that speech was carefully calculated, a desperate attempt to manipulate the jury as he had manipulated so many people before. Jeff's gaze turned to William, who sat motionless, his fists clenched. "And William," Jeff continued, in a tone that almost sounded like a plea, "you know how it was. You helped me. You believed in me. Can't you understand that it all got out of control? The words cut through the air like a knife, but William did not yield. He just stared back at Jeff, refusing to be manipulated again. The prosecutor wasted no time. As soon as Jeff finished his speech, she stood up with an expression of controlled indignation. "Desperate?" she asked, her voice echoing through the room. Mr. Sinclair was not desperate when he coldly planned the murder of Thomas. He was not desperate when he stole the victim's belongings. And he was definitely not desperate when he tried to permanently silence Detective John to cover up his crimes. That is not desperation. That is premeditation. Her voice was clear, cutting, and the jury seemed to absorb every word. The days of the trial passed in a blur for William. He watched, but his emotions oscillated between rage and exhaustion. When the jury finally withdrew to deliberate, the silence in the room was almost deafening. Hours later, they returned with the verdict. The judge asked the defendant to stand, and Jeff obeyed, his posture still firm, but his face now marked by a slight nervousness. "Mr. Sinclair," the judge began, his voice grave, "the jury has found you guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder, attempted homicide, and aggravated robbery." The murmur in the room was cut off as the judge continued. "Given the heinous nature of your crimes, this court sees no alternative but to impose the maximum penalty. Jeff Sinclair, you are hereby sentenced to death, to be carried out by electric chair." The word sounded like a final hammer blow, crushing and irrevocable. For a moment, Jeff stood motionless, as if he didn't believe what he had just heard. But then he turned to the judge, his mask of calm finally cracking. "This is a mistake," he shouted, his voice laced with desperation. "You're condemning me without understanding the truth. I was pushed into this. I'm not the real culprit." The guards quickly moved in to restrain him, but Jeff continued to struggle, shouting his last words as he was led out of the courtroom. "You don't know what you're doing. This is a mistake." His words echoed through the courtroom, but no one seemed willing to listen. For William, that moment was both a victory and a wound. He knew Jeff was receiving the punishment he deserved, but the weight of what had happened would continue to haunt him. As the room emptied, he remained seated for a few minutes, trying to find some sense in it all. Days later, the execution was scheduled. Jeff, now a defeated man, was led to the execution chamber with the heavy steps of someone who knew there was no escape. When the chaplain asked if he had anything to say, he raised his eyes, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm innocent," he said, repeating the same phrase that William had uttered at his own trial. Then he made the sign of the cross with his left hand, a gesture that carried more defiance than faith. Moments later, the switch was thrown and silence fell over the room. For William, that was the final punctuation mark of a long and painful journey. Jeff was dead, and justice had been served, but he knew the scars of what he had lived through would remain with him forever. The execution chamber slowly emptied, but William stayed behind, staring at the now vacant chair. "It's over," he muttered to himself, but he knew the weight of that story would stay with him for a long time. Months had passed since Jeff's execution, and William's life was finally starting to find balance. The weight of the trial and the traumas he carried were still present, but slowly he began to understand that he couldn't live forever, trapped in the past. For the first time in years, he felt he had room to breathe. The pain hadn't disappeared completely, but had transformed into something more bearable, like a distant memory that helped him appreciate the present. On that sunny morning, William walked through the park near his home. The sound of children playing and the scent of freshly opened flowers brought a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He stopped to sit on one of the benches, taking in the scene around him. There was something comforting in the simplicity of that moment. For the first time, he realized that life went on, and he needed to go on as well. As William sat there, lost in thought, a gray-haired woman with a kind expression approached with a warm smile. "You're William Hayes, aren't you?" she asked, holding a small notebook in her hands. He looked up, surprised, but nodded. "I am. How can I help you?" The woman sat down beside him and explained that she was a local journalist. She had followed Jeff's case and was impressed by William's courage throughout the process. "I know you probably don't want to revisit all of this," she said, "but I think people need to hear your story. Not about the crime itself, but about your resilience, your strength." William hesitated for a moment. He had never considered sharing his perspective on what had happened, but as he looked into the woman's kind eyes, He felt that maybe this could be a way to move forward. "Okay," he responded with a slight smile. "But if we're going to tell that story, I want it to be about overcoming, not about the dark past." The woman nodded, and the two began to talk, their voices mingling with the soft sounds of the park. The interview was published weeks later, and William was surprised by the positive response he received. People in the community began approaching him, not to ask about the crime, but to thank him for his strength and for inspiring them to face their own struggles. He was invited to give talks at schools and community centers, sharing his journey and encouraging people to believe in human resilience. Each time he took the stage, William felt he was somehow finding purpose in all the pain he had endured. One day after one of those talks, a young woman approached him. She held a notebook and had a shy smile on her face. "Mr. Hayes, I wanted to thank you for your story," she said, her voice laden with emotion. "I've been through something really difficult too, and hearing you speak gave me the courage to keep going." William felt a lump in his throat. The idea that his experience could help someone was something he had never imagined. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "If my story can help you in any way, then it was all worth it." As the months turned into years, William continued to rebuild his life. He began volunteering at a shelter for homeless people, offering support and hope to those facing the same struggles he believed Jeff had faced in the past. Although Jeff's ghost still lingered in his mind from time to time, William did not let it consume him. He knew that by helping others, he was finding redemption not only for himself, but also for everyone who had been affected by the events of that case. On a sunny spring day, as the fresh scent of flowers filled the air, William was at the shelter organizing piles of donated clothing. The atmosphere was lively, with volunteers coming and going, boxes being opened, and cheerful voices exchanging ideas on how best to help those who would come seeking support. The work, though simple, brought William a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in a long time. He focused on the clothes he carefully folded, each item representing a small but significant chance of comfort for someone. It was then that an elderly lady, with hair as white as snow and a smile that radiated kindness, approached him holding a plate covered with an embroidered linen cloth. "William," she said, her voice soft and welcoming like a gentle breeze, "I made an apple pie. I remembered when you said it was your favorite dessert as a child." Her eyes sparkled as she mentioned the gesture, as if she knew exactly the impact it would have. William looked at her with surprise and emotion, his lips forming a genuine smile as he carefully took the plate, almost as if receiving a precious gift. The sweet, familiar aroma of the pie immediately wafted up, filling the air around him. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling the scent that transported him to the carefree days of his youth, when his mother would bake similar pies in their small home kitchen. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but laden with gratitude. "This means so much to me." The lady smiled even more, holding his hands for a moment before bidding farewell, leaving William with the plate and a heart full of conflicting emotions. He looked down at the pie in his hands, realizing that this simple gesture symbolized much more than a favorite dessert. It represented care, support, and the ability to find joy in the most unexpected moments. For the first time, he began to understand that happiness wasn't about erasing the scars of the past, but about finding ways to celebrate the small miracles of the present. Later, as he walked back home, the plate carefully wrapped in his hands, William felt the warmth of the sun on his face and the fresh spring breeze. The trees lining the path swayed gently, and the sound of birds filled the air with a peaceful melody. He looked around, taking in every detail of that moment, and realized how long it had been since he had allowed himself to simply exist. The road he traveled, though ordinary and routine, seemed full of meaning that evening. It was as if the world around him was trying to remind him that even after darkness, there would always be light. If Thomas and William's story touched you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and check out the story now appearing on screen, specially chosen for you. See you soon.